Glad to have you in the shop today. It's a little bit brisk. I can still see my breath, but it's going to warm up and be a pretty nice day to work in the shop today. A couple of our recent videos, I've noticed that I keep mentioning, go back and watch how to make a hammer's eye, punch, and drift, because we're using other tools that are made similarly. So I thought instead of always referring back to tools that were very specific to making a hammer, we'd make some more generic hot chisels and punches that can be used for a variety of projects and aren't really single-purpose tools. They're the kind of tools you use day in and day out in the shop. So we're going to at least make a chisel and a punch today. We might make a little slot punch as well, and we'll just see how it goes. Well, these are similar tools. These are all made at different times from different source materials, and these are not exactly what we're going to make. These are just some of the tools that I happen to already have. So we'll get started and we'll make some brand new tools. Well, I certainly think that new tool steel is the way to go most of the time. For people just starting out, it's fairly easy to come by some of this stuff. Coil spring. We've used this for a few projects previously, and we'll cut a few more pieces off of it today. This is a fairly heavy spring, not the biggest I've ever seen, but this is almost 3/4 of an inch round, so it'll make pretty good tools. Sucker rod would be good, but again, new tool steel, new 01, new 5160, 4140, all make very good tools, and you'd be very happy with them, and that stuff's not that hard to come by. I'm just going to cut a section of this off first with the angle grinder. So we're just going to put our section of coil spring in the fire, let it get hot, we're going to straighten it out, and then we'll be able to work with it. So we're just going to fiddle this around until it's kind of straight. It's always a little bit weird. Get it in the hardy hole, that'll hold it while we bend it around and get it straighter. That's a little bit of a crude way to do it though. The better technique is a bending fork in the anvil, a bending fork in the vise. This is a much better technique. Now that that's straightening out, it's a lot easier to get it on the anvil and create a straight section. So it's a little bit fussy, but completely doable. Now we can hold on to it. It's a lot easier to just put it in the vise and bend it around. So that's all we'll need to do in the vise. We can straighten the rest of that on the anvil. Now this ends up being right about 24 inches. If I cut that into 3 8-inch pieces, I can get 3 equal length tools, and that's not bad, but I kind of prefer my tools to be more in the 10-inch range. This hot chisel that I like so much is just a little over. Most of my stuff is probably a hair under. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it into 2 9-inch pieces. That'll leave us a 6-inch piece left over. So there's 9 inches and 18 inches. This is still hot enough and hasn't started to harden again. I can make a little nick in there so I can find these marks again hot. So we can cut that off hot. You could also just let this air cool and cut it off with your angle grinder or chop saw. I try not to put this stuff in a bandsaw or use a hacksaw too much unless it's really been annealed, because it's still pretty tough stuff and it's hard on saw blades. And as always, you don't really want to cut all the way through. Break it off at the end. So there's one piece that'll make a tool. Since that's cooling off, this is going to be real easy to just snap off here. So that should be a 9-inch piece there. Pretty close. Leaves us about 6 inches there. Typically I would work these, I'd probably put all 3 of these pieces in the gas forge at once and alternate which one I'm working on while the others heat. But so as not to confuse the video, we'll just work these one at a time. Now we have a pretty ragged edge right here that I'm just going to grind off later. I'm not going to forge that in. I don't want to take a chance on creating a stress riser. And I think that'll be the struck end of the tool ultimately. I'm going to start there and just lightly square this up and then knock the corners down. You don't need to do this. This is just an aesthetic consideration. I think it makes the punch look better and I enjoy using it more. But you can leave that round. There's absolutely no harm in it. In fact, I'm going to continue that pretty much all the way up the side here. think what I'm going to end up doing is pretty much just making an octagon stock here. And you want to end up with a straight piece when you're done. And that's a little over halfway, maybe 2/3. So I'm pretty happy with the way the octagon is at this point. Now I want to taper out just the end, and we'll make this into our round punch. So even though we have already made this octagon, because I'm drawing it out, we're going to go back to square to draw it out. Then we'll make an octagon out of that square. What I'm going for here is about a 1/4 inch round punch. So I'm going to taper that down until it's 1/4 inch square, more or less. Now you don't want a shoulder way up here with a 1/4 inch parallel. You'll end up bending that punching material. Most of what you're punching will only be about 1/4, 3/8 thick, half at the most. So as long as you've got about 3/4 of an inch of decent round punch at the end, it's going to be plenty to punch a good hole. So that's about all I need to do in a square cross section. Now we want to go to octagon. Try to keep your flats lining up from the original octagon to this one. It'll look better. So there we have an octagon taper, and now I'll round up just the very end of it. So now we just round that up. And everything else will be completed by hot rasping, filing, or grinding. Entirely your choice at that point. And we end up with a punch. Right now is just a little over 10 inches long. By the time I dress the ends up, it'll be probably just a hair under 10 inches. Now if you know what the material is, I recommend stamping that on the side of the punch for future reference. That helps you decide, do I like this material for a punch, or do I not like the way it performs? But if you ever have to reforge it or reharden it and temper it, it will also give you an idea of how you're going to harden and temper it. We're continuing with the same squared octagon routine that we've done previously. And of course, this is real easy to do under a power hammer with flat dies. Do it under a treadle hammer. probably even the fly press. And if you set up stop blocks, you could probably do it under hydraulic press, but that seems like a lot of overkill to me. But in the long run, try to develop your hand skills. So once you have your octagon, we can turn this into a chisel. It's just a matter of spreading this out. You might want to use your cross peen and work from both sides, but don't go too far with the cross peen. You may have trouble getting those marks back out. Now I'm lifting my tong end up to match the angle that I'm tipping my hammer. If you work flat, all you're doing is pushing this back and forth from one side to the other. Now then, this is actually about an 1/8 inch thick right now, and probably about an inch wide. If you wanted a slot punch, when we were slot punching the bottle opener, that's pretty much where you would stop. Later you'd come back and you'd grind this straight across and round up these corners so that you have a nice round transition on your punched hole. But it's really just that simple. The slot punch and the chisel are about the same thing at this stage. But since I'm going for a chisel, I'm going to continue to work that a little bit. I've got that just a little twisted from my original flat, so I'm trying to fix that. As you get right up to the edge, work up the anvil so you're not hitting your anvil. Try and keep it all centered and symmetrical. So we are pretty much done with this. Just a quick straightening up. Everything else will be done on the grinder. Or if you don't have a grinder, as always, you can hot rasp, file, whatever suits your fancy. So now this will go into the bucket of vermiculite. It'll cool, and then I'm going to bring it back up to heat first. Then bucket of vermiculite, cool so it anneals, then we'll grind it, then we'll harden and temper it. I decided the final tool I'm going to make is going to be a little cold chisel that will be very useful for cutting out sheet metal. Exact same procedure, except a little bit steeper bevel, or less acute bevel, because you want this to stand up to working cold material, so it's going to need to be stout. The truth is, that's about all you need to do to it. Very simple tool to make. I think I'll take one more heat just to clean it up and straighten it a little bit. Because this will need to turn corners in some of the sheet metal work, it doesn't want to be a very wide chisel. So that's all the forge work for all three tools. We're going to let these anneal over lunch, and then I'll pick back up this afternoon and we'll do the grinding, the hardening, and the tempering. Or at least we'll harden and temper one. Once you've seen one, you don't really need to see all three of them. One good alternative to using a grinder is always hot rasping. Keep the material hot, and this goes pretty well. You can take a lot of material off. In a used farrier's file that's already too worn out for the local farrier to use will last you for years and probably cost you a couple of dollars, or most of them will give them to you for free, and that's a lot cheaper than a $1,000 grinder. And of course you can file these. Did a nice job of forging. This won't take very much. Get the end sharp and square. You do a good job of annealing these and cool them as slow as you possibly can, they will be a lot easier to file. Remember, this is a round punch, so check it and make sure you're getting it round. A little bit of a high spot right there. So that's a lot better. That's really all it takes to file that round punch. I didn't do any hot rasping on that. That's all with a file. And we'll need to do this end. You can actually cut that off if you've got an angle grinder or a chop saw. Instead of filing that, you can cut it off and then just file a bevel to keep it from mushrooming so bad. As we get into power tool options, you can use an angle grinder. The hard wheel leaves a really rough finish. You go to these sandpaper flap discs that are available in a lot of different grits to finish them up some. And that goes pretty darn quick. And of course there's always the belt grinder. So here we have our three tools that have been finished enough for hardening and tempering. We have a round punch that's about a 1/4 inch diameter round. These can all be cleaned up a little bit more after. That's pretty much right on a 1/4 inch. These can be cleaned up after hardening and tempering. In fact, they'll need to be sharpened on a regular basis anyways. Our chisel, our hot chisel, is 1 inch wide. Both of these tools are right at 10 inches long, which is kind of what I like. I wouldn't mind them being a little heavier, which is a reason to buy new steel. I could have bought 1 inch round instead of using the 3/4 inch spring, simply because it was what was on hand. But these will certainly work. Our cold chisel is shorter. It's about 6 inches long and 3/4 of an inch wide. Now, a cold chisel doesn't have to be as long because you're not working up against hot material. The hot chisel, if you're working down here, your hand is roasting, so it's nice to have a little distance with a hot chisel or a hot punch. So we're going to harden and temper these. Now, there is some logic to not worrying about it with these two tools. These are hot use tools. They are a good tough steel. They're going to survive a certain amount of work even if you don't harden and temper them. And they're going to soften in use. These are going to get way hotter than what I'm going to temper them. Oh, back a half, 3/4 of an inch up on a regular basis. So if you don't harden and temper them, you'll just need to clean them up and sharpen them more often. But you could probably skip that step and get by with it. The cold chisel, on the other hand, is going to work cold metal, and it has to be hardened. So that's a pretty important tool to harden. All of these we can harden a bit of it and let the colors bleed for tempering, and we may do that with one of them. But in the long run, I prefer to just put them in the little toaster oven and guarantee I get them to the right temperature all the way through. They can soak. And it lets me go on to something else while they're tempering instead of standing here watching them. It was down in the 20s here last night, so I've heated up this bar. It's still a black heat. I'm going to put it in my oil bath here and let that heat up. When I'm just doing this myself and I'm not doing it for the camera, I put this near an open door because I really don't want to breathe this nasty stuff. While these come up to temperature, I'm going to turn the forge off a little bit for a little while here and let them soak. I want them to come up to temperature as slowly as I possibly can to make sure it's evenly hot all the way through. It's possible to have a hot outside and still have the core of the tool cold. If you do that, you're liable to crack it. Well, perhaps cold is not the right word. Not fully up to temperature. Now that edge is good, that it's non-magnetic. It's magnetic back here. So we're pretty much right where we want. Make sure you quench on a rising heat. We're going to quench in our preheated oil. We're going to do about the last inch or so. That's really all that matters. Nothing else is ever going to be used as a hot work tool. You want to make sure it's completely cooled and move it up and down a little bit so you don't have a stress line right at the cold and hot mark there. It's okay to quench the entire tool if you're going to if you're going to temper this in an oven. You don't have to quench only the end. This is just the old blacksmith's way of doing things. The other two tools I'm actually going to put in the toaster oven. I'm going to scrub up that edge with a brick just to make it shine. We'll have to polish that back out later. And then we're going to let the temper colors run up to the edge. This is actually moving pretty quick already. You can see the colors back in here. It's blue, and you can see some straw up closer to the edge. We're going to take this till it's kind of a peacock color. Like I say, it's going to take so much abuse when you use it that it's not going to be very well tempered anyways. So it's better to over temper it than it is to leave it brittle. You can see that's starting to be a bronze color. Now we're getting into that peacock. That's where we're going to quench them. We didn't do any hardening to the struck end. It doesn't need it. It's going to mushroom a little in use. You just have to dress that off often, but that'll keep it from being brittle. So that's all we're going to do to that one, as far as hardening and tempering goes anyways. Now we're going to harden these other two tools exactly the same. The only difference will be the tempering procedure. So I'm not going to bother to show the full hardening procedure. We'll save a little bit of time on the video. Well, we have our three tools. They've been hardened, they've been tempered. Now they're just ready for a final cleanup on the grinder and a sharpening. Again, you can do this with a file. They will not file as easily after being hardened and tempered as they did when they were annealed, but you can still do it with a file if that's all you have. And you can do it with an angle grinder. Just be careful not to radically overheat them or you're going to draw too much temper and they'll be a lot softer. Which for the hot tools, not really a big deal. For the cold chisel, that is kind of important. We now have three new tools to add to our collection of blacksmithing tools. These will be good, useful tools that should last for years. We have our round punch, which has a 1/4 inch round end on it. And for thin material, that'll punch a nice 1/4 inch hole. In a little bit heavier material, by the time you get through, it's going to be a little bigger. But you can also drift the hole clear up to this end here. And we'll show that at some point in the video. But that means you could get almost a 3/4 inch hole starting with a 1/4 inch and drifting larger. And that's a very useful technique, good useful tool. We have a hot chisel. As we said, it was 1 inch wide. Now the difference between the hot chisel and the cold chisel, besides the length, is the bevel. A hot chisel has a fairly sharp angle on it, something like that. And this is the part you sharpen right here. A cold chisel is a much blunter angle. I don't know exactly what the technically correct angles are here, but this kind of gives you an idea. And the reason for this is cold material is harder to cut, and it's going to be a lot more abusive. And this edge would fold over and go dull really fast in cold material. This edge will last longer in cold material. Both of these chisels, the end has rounded corners, and the hot chisel is more rounded all the way around. That means that you can work this in a slot by walking it along the material as you chisel, and it makes it a little easier and you don't get the edge gouging and digging in. I'm a little flatter across here on the cold chisel. And the reason for knocking the corners off, cold chisel frequently isn't used that way, but if we're cutting sheet metal parts, that's exactly how you'll use it. And in the next couple of videos, I will take one of those and we will make a shovel to go with our fireplace poker, and we'll cut the pan out using this chisel. So that's it for today. Head on out to the shop, make something, make some of your own tools. You don't have to buy all your tools. I'd appreciate it if you give a thumbs up to the video, hit that subscribe button down below. Be safe, wear your safety glasses, and we'll see you for the next one.